Before anyone knew what would happen, the morning at the small regional airport felt ordinary. The sky was clear, the wind calm, and flights were moving on schedule. Ground staff walked with routine speed. Pilots checked their instruments, and passengers boarded a large passenger plane, thinking only about reaching their destination. Among the workers on the ground was a 19-year-old aircraft mechanic trainee. He was young, quiet, and often overlooked. Most people saw him as just another helper, someone too inexperienced to matter in serious situations. He had been working near the runway since early morning, assisting senior engineers and observing final checks before takeoff. He did not speak much, but he watched everything closely. Since childhood, he had been fascinated by machines. He learned by listening, by observing, and by asking careful questions when no one was in a hurry. Even though he was only 19, he had already spent thousands of hours studying engines, fuel systems, and emergency procedures. He believed that machines always spoke if someone paid attention. As the plane began to move toward the runway, the mechanic felt a strange discomfort. Something did not feel right. He noticed a faint vibration that did not match the normal sound of an aircraft preparing for takeoff. At first, he told himself he might be imagining it. After all, this plane had passed inspection. Experienced engineers had signed off on it. Who was he to question that? But as the engines increased power, his concern grew stronger. He watched the plane carefully as it lined up for takeoff. His eyes focused on the engine intake and exhaust patterns. The sound was wrong. Not loud enough, not strong enough. It was subtle, but to him, it felt dangerous. He remembered a lesson his mentor once told him. Engines don't fail loudly at first. They whisper. The plane began accelerating down the runway. Passengers inside felt the familiar push into their seats. Some closed their eyes. Some smiled. Some checked their phones. None of them knew that something was seriously wrong. The aircraft was gaining speed, but not the speed it needed. The engines were not delivering full power. The mechanic's heart started racing. He ran closer to the runway line, waving his arms, trying to catch someone's attention. Ground control. Staff were busy. The pilots were focused on instruments. The plane was already moving too fast to stop easily. For a moment he froze, terrified of being wrong. If he was wrong, he would embarrass himself. If he was right, hundreds of lives were at risk. Then he remembered why he chose this job in the first place. It was never about recognition. It was about safety. He grabbed a radio from a nearby ground worker and shouted into it, his voice shaking but clear. He reported a suspected power failure during takeoff. His words were fast, urgent, and raw. At first, the response was confused. People questioned him. He was young. He was not the lead engineer, but his tone carried something stronger than authority. It carried certainty. Inside the cockpit, warning lights began flickering. The pilots realized something was indeed wrong. The aircraft was near rotation speed, but not climbing as expected. The runway was running out. The situation turned critical within seconds. Ground control ordered an immediate abort, but the plane was already airborne by a thin margin. It lifted off weakly, struggling against gravity. The pilots fought to keep it stable. With low engine power, the aircraft could not climb properly. Buildings and trees loomed ahead. The mechanic stood frozen, watching the plane wobble in the air. His hands trembled. He whispered a prayer, blaming himself for not speaking earlier, fearing he had spoken too late. Inside the plane, panic started spreading as the aircraft failed to gain altitude. The pilots made rapid decisions, shutting down non-essential systems and following emergency protocols. They worked with pure focus, knowing that every second mattered. The plane turned slowly, barely clearing the airport boundary. Fuel imbalance and partial engine failure were now confirmed. The pilots needed guidance from the ground, and fast. Back on the runway, The young mechanic was pulled into the emergency response room. Engineers questioned him intensely. He explained everything he had noticed, every sound, every vibration, every small detail. He spoke calmly now, like someone who had trained for this moment his entire life. As the plane circled the airport, carrying 418 passengers and crew, the mechanic helped identify the likely cause: a critical fuel flow restriction that starved the engines during high demand. It was rare. It was dangerous. And it was almost invisible during routine checks. The pilots prepared for an emergency return, knowing the landing would be difficult. Fuel was uneven. Power was limited. But they had information they needed, just in time. On the ground, the mechanic watched the radar screen, his chest tight. He had done all he could. Now 418 lives depended on what happened next, and this was only the beginning. The plane stayed in the air, but only just. From the ground, it looked like it was floating instead of flying. Inside the cockpit, the pilots could feel it clearly. The controls felt heavy, slow to respond. The aircraft was not behaving like it should. One engine was producing weak thrust, and the other was unstable. Every instrument was being watched closely, every sound analyzed. Inside the cabin, passengers began to sense that something was wrong. The usual smooth climb never came. Instead, there was a long, uneasy feeling of being suspended. Some people looked out of the windows and noticed how low the plane still was. Houses, roads, and cars were visible in too much detail. A few passengers tightened their seatbelts. A child asked his mother why the plane was flying so slowly. No one had answers yet. In the emergency control room, tension filled the air. Screens showed live data. Voices overlapped. Senior engineers argued about possible causes. Some believed it was a sensor issue. Others thought it could be temporary. Power fluctuation. The young mechanic stood quietly at the edge, listening. He did not interrupt. He waited for the right moment. He replayed everything in his mind. The sound, the vibration, the timing. It was not random. It was not a software glitch. It was mechanical, and it was dangerous. When the discussion slowed, he spoke again, more clearly this time. He explained that the power loss increased exactly at high throttle demand. He insisted it pointed to fuel starvation, not engine damage. If they tried to push the engines harder, it could make things worse. Some doubted him. A few looked annoyed. But one senior engineer noticed something important. The data matched what the young mechanic was saying. Fuel pressure was unstable during climb. That changed everything. The pilots were informed immediately. They adjusted their plan. Instead of attempting a normal emergency landing, they prepared for a heavy, controlled return with limited thrust. The aircraft would stay light, avoid sharp turns, and burn fuel carefully. It would not be easy, but it was possible. Inside the cockpit, sweat ran down faces despite the cold air. The pilots spoke in short, precise sentences. There was no panic, only pressure. They trusted the information from the ground. They trusted the process. And unknowingly, they trusted a 19-year-old mechanic they had never met. In the cabin, the captain finally spoke to the passengers. His voice was calm, steady, and controlled. He explained that there was a technical issue and the plane would be returning to the airport as a precaution. He asked everyone to remain seated and follow crew instructions. The word emergency was never used, but people could feel it anyway. Flight attendants moved through the aisle, checking seatbelts, calming nervous passengers, smiling even when their own hands shook. Training took over. Calm was their strongest tool. Back on the ground, emergency services lined the runway. Fire trucks, medical teams, flashing lights. Everyone prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. The mechanic watched silently. His heart pounded. He knew that if the landing failed, people might question every decision made today. including his. He wondered if he would be blamed. He wondered if he should have done more. But deep down, he knew he had followed his instincts and his training. That had to be enough. The plane began its final approach. From the ground, it looked massive and fragile at the same time. Its speed was higher than normal. Its descent was steeper. The pilots needed precision down to the smallest movement. Inside the cockpit, alarms sounded briefly, then went quiet. The pilots corrected, adjusted, focused. The runway lights guided them closer. Wind conditions were favorable, but there was no room for error. In the final seconds before touchdown, everything felt slow. Time stretched. The wheels hit the runway hard, bouncing once, then gripping the ground. The engines roared unevenly as reverse thrust engaged. The aircraft shook, rattled, and rolled forward fast. People inside screamed. Some cried. Some prayed. Some held hands with strangers. Then, slowly, the speed dropped. The plane stayed on the runway. When it finally came to a complete stop, silence filled the cabin for half a second. Then came applause. Loud, emotional, uncontrollable. Tears flowed freely. Passengers hugged each other. Crew members closed their eyes in relief. On the ground, people exhaled breaths they did not realize they were holding. The mechanic felt his legs weaken. He sat down, his hands shaking, tears in his eyes. 418 lives were safe, but no one yet knew how close they had come, and no one yet knew the full role the youngest person on the ground had played. The celebration inside the plane did not last long. Safety came first. The cabin crew instructed everyone to remain seated while emergency teams surrounded the aircraft. Fire trucks sprayed cooling foam near the engines, and medical staff stood ready, scanning faces through the windows. From the outside, it looked dramatic. From the inside, it felt unreal, like a dream that had not fully ended. In the cockpit, the pilots sat quietly for a moment, hands still on the controls. Their bodies were exhausted, but their minds were alert. One of them looked at the engine readings again and shook his head slowly. This was not a small issue. If the plane had climbed higher, the outcome could have been very different. Passengers were guided off the aircraft in an orderly way. Some kissed the ground when they stepped onto the tarmac. Others wiped tears and made phone calls with shaking hands. A few looked back at the plane, trying to understand how something so normal could suddenly become so dangerous. Inside the hangar, the investigation began almost immediately. Engineers gathered around the aircraft, opening panels, checking lines, and reviewing data. The atmosphere changed from relief to seriousness. This was now about understanding what happened and making sure it never happened again. The young mechanic stood near the edge, watching. He felt small again, like he usually did. No one was celebrating him. No one was pointing or clapping, and that was fine. He did not come here for that. Still, his heart raced as engineers discussed the fuel system. Then someone called him forward. Senior engineer asked him to explain, again, what he noticed before takeoff. This time, everyone listened. He spoke carefully, choosing his words, describing the sound difference, the weak exhaust pressure, the way the engine response felt delayed. He explained how it reminded him of a past training case involving partial fuel blockage. They followed his logic step by step. As panels were removed, they found it. A small but dangerous obstruction in the fuel line, caused by contamination that slipped through filters during refueling. Under normal conditions, it was manageable. Under takeoff power, it was deadly. The room went quiet. The truth settled in. If the plane had continued climbing, engine failure at altitude would have been unavoidable. Recovery would have been unlikely. The number 418 echoed in many minds. Later that day, the pilots asked to meet the mechanic. When he entered the room, he expected questions. Instead, he received a firm handshake. One pilot looked him in the eyes and said simply that his early warning made all the difference. No speeches. No dramatic praise. Just respect. News of the incident began spreading, but the story focused on the pilots, the emergency landing. News of the incident began spreading, but the story focused on the pilots, the emergency landing. Airport response. The mechanic's role stayed mostly invisible. That did not bother him. He returned to work the next morning, early as always, checking tools, reviewing manuals, learning more, but something had changed. People looked at him differently now. They listened when he spoke. They asked for his opinion. Not because of his age, but because he had proven something important. Skill does not wait for years to pass. Responsibility does not care how old. Someone is in the days that followed. Safety procedures were reviewed. Training manuals were updated. Fuel inspection rules became stricter. The near disaster became a lesson shared across teams and airports. The mechanic watched all of this quietly. He thought about how close everything came to falling apart. One ignored detail. One moment of doubt. One voice not heard, and he promised himself something that day. He would never stop paying attention, because sometimes the smallest voice on the ground is the only thing standing between disaster and 418 lives going home safely. Asterisk days passed, but the memory refused to fade. The airport returned to its normal rhythm, yet for those who had been close to the incident, everything felt different. The runway looked the same. The planes took off and landed as always, but behind the routine, there was a new awareness. People had seen how thin the line was between normal and disaster. The aircraft involved was grounded for deep inspection. Engineers from outside teams arrived, reviewing every step taken before the flight. Reports were written, data analyzed, and long. Meetings filled with careful words followed. The incident was no longer just an emergency landing. It became a serious case study. The young mechanic continued his daily work, but now his days were heavier. He double-checked everything, sometimes 3 times. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood responsibility in a deeper way. He had seen what a small overlooked detail could do. One afternoon, he was asked to speak during a safety review session. He was nervous. He had never addressed a room full of experienced professionals before. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed his nerves. He spoke about listening to machines, about trusting instincts backed by learning, and about the danger of assuming that youth means inexperience. The room stayed silent as he finished. No one rushed to speak. Then slowly, heads nodded. Some engineers admitted they had ignored similar feelings in the past. Others realized they relied too much on checklists and not enough on awareness. Word of the session spread beyond the airport. Training centers requested permission to include the incident in their programs. New trainees heard the story not as a dramatic rescue, but as a lesson in attention, humility, and courage. Meanwhile, passengers from the flight began sharing their own stories online. They spoke about fear, gratitude, and the calm voices that guided them. Many thanked the pilots and crew. Few knew about the mechanic. That was fine. Impact does not always need recognition to be real. One message, however, reached him personally. A passenger wrote about holding their child during the landing, thinking it might be the last moment they would share. The message ended with simple words of thanks, without even knowing his name. The mechanic read it twice, then closed his phone, and sat quietly for a long time. He realized that saving lives is not always loud. Sometimes it happens before anyone notices danger. Sometimes it happens in silence. As investigations closed, new protocols were approved. Fuel quality checks increased. Communication lines between ground crews and pilots were strengthened. A culture shift began, slow but steady. The young mechanic watched planes take off each day, feeling a mix of pride and humility. He knew there would be other close calls in aviation. That was reality. But he also knew something else now. Being young did not make him unimportant. Paying attention made him essential. And far above the runway, every plane that climbed safely carried a reminder of how close 418 lives once came to never reaching home. Life did not suddenly turn into something extraordinary for the young mechanic. There were no interviews waiting for him, no crowds, no headlines with his face. Instead, there were early mornings, cold hangars, and the familiar smell of fuel and metal. But inside him, something had shifted forever. He began mentoring newer trainees, even though he was still young himself. He did not speak like a teacher. He spoke like someone who had learned a hard truth early. He told them that machines do not always fail in obvious ways. He told them that confidence should never replace attention. And most importantly, he told them that fear of speaking up can be more dangerous than being wrong. Some listened carefully. Some smiled politely and moved on. He knew not everyone would understand until they faced their own moment. The airport slowly absorbed the lessons from the incident. Supervisors encouraged open communication. Junior staff were invited into discussions they were once excluded from. The culture began to change, not because of rules, but because of trust. One evening, as the mechanic finished his shift, he stood near the runway and watched a plane lift smoothly into the sky. The engine sounded strong, clean, alive. For the first time since the incident, he felt peace instead of tension. He realized he had been carrying the weight of that day without noticing. At home, his family noticed the change too. He spoke less, thought more. He valued time differently. Simple moments felt heavier, more meaningful. He knew how quickly everything could disappear. Months later, a safety board released its final report. It confirmed what many already knew. The disaster had been avoided because someone noticed what others missed and acted without hesitation. The report did not focus on age or job title. It focused on awareness and action. The mechanic read the report quietly. He did not feel pride. He felt responsibility. He understood now that this was not a single moment in his life. It was a standard he would have to live up to every day. The pilots returned to flying after retraining. The aircraft returned to service after modifications. Passengers continued to travel, unaware of the invisible systems protecting them. Aviation moved forward, as it always does, but the mechanic carried something rare. He carried proof that doing the right thing at the right moment, even when no one expects it from you, can change hundreds of lives. He promised himself that no matter where his career took him, he would never stop listening, never stop learning, and never let silence stand in the way of safety. Because once, at 19 years old, he had stood on the ground and helped bring 418 people safely back to it, and that responsibility would follow him forever. Time moved forward, but the day never truly left him. Even as new aircraft arrived and old ones retired, the memory stayed sharp, not as fear, but as a quiet reminder. Every bolt he tightened, every panel he checked, carried extra meaning now. Opportunities slowly opened. He was offered advanced training earlier than expected, not as a reward, but because people trusted his judgment. He worked harder than ever, aware that trust is easy to lose and difficult to earn. He studied late into the night, reviewed past incidents, and learned from mistakes made by others long before him. One training session stood out. A simulated emergency mirrored the incident almost exactly. Many trainees followed procedures without question. He paused, listened, and caught the same pattern again. The instructor stopped the simulation and nodded. The lesson was clear. Outside work, he stayed grounded. He avoided pride. He knew how close everything came to ending differently. He stayed connected to his roots, reminding himself that skill matters more than recognition. Occasionally, he thought about the passengers, about the families who reached home safely, about the lives that continued because of one decision. He did not know their faces, but he carried their safety as motivation. The aviation world moved fast. New technology, new systems, new risks. But one truth remained unchanged. Machines can fail. Humans must not ignore warning signs. The mechanic became known for his calm presence. When others panicked, he focused. When others rushed, he slowed down. He understood that speed without clarity can be dangerous. Years from now, people might forget the details of that flight. They might forget the number 418, but the systems improved because of that day would protect countless others. And deep inside, he knew something simple yet powerful. Age never defines responsibility. Attention does. And because he paid attention once, hundreds of lives were given the chance to keep moving forward. The airport eventually forgot the noise of that day, but the lesson stayed alive in quiet ways. New signs were placed. New procedures were printed. New voices were encouraged to speak, even if they sounded unsure. The system had learned, and it had learned because someone young refused to ignore a feeling. For the mechanic, the work became deeper, not louder. He noticed details others skipped because they had become routine. A change in smell, a delay in response, a sound that felt slightly off. These were not dramatic signs, but he knew now that danger rarely announces itself. One afternoon, a senior supervisor asked him a simple question: why he always took a moment longer before approving a system. He answered honestly. He said that once you realize how many lives depend on a single decision, you stop rushing. Silence filled the room, not because the answer was impressive, but because it was true. New trainees were paired with him during critical checks. Not because he was the most experienced, but because he was the most careful. He taught them that courage is not only about acting fast. Sometimes it is about speaking up when your voice shakes. The story of the flight slowly turned into a training example. No drama, no heroes. Just a chain of small choices that prevented a disaster. That was how safety truly worked. Late one evening, he stood again near the runway. Another plane lifted. Into the dark sky, lights blinking like stars. He felt no fear this time. Only respect. Respect for the responsibility, for the people in the air, and for the unseen work that keeps them safe. He understood now that his life would be shaped by that moment, not defined by it. There would be other challenges, other decisions, other risks. And when they came, he would be ready. Because once, when it mattered most, he chose to listen. And 418 lives went home because of it. Years later, the memory still surfaced in unexpected moments. Not as fear, not as pride, but as clarity. The young mechanic was no longer 19, but the lesson from that day had aged with him. It shaped how he worked, how he spoke, and how he made decisions when no one was watching. He had moved on to greater responsibility, guiding teams rather than just systems. Yet his habits remained the same. He listened first. He questioned quietly. He trusted data, but he also trusted human awareness. People noticed that when he entered a hangar, the noise seemed to soften. Focus followed him. The incident with the flight was now part of formal training material. New engineers studied it without knowing his name. That anonymity never bothered him. What mattered was that the lesson lived on. A system had changed. Lives had been protected far beyond that single flight. One evening, after a long shift, he received a message from an unknown number. It was short and simple. A passenger from that flight had finally learned the full story. The message said they had named their child after the idea of hope, because that day taught them what it meant. He read the message once and then put his phone away, eyes heavy with emotion. He did not need thanks. He did not need recognition. He already knew the value of what happened. As another plane climbed into the sky, carrying strangers toward their futures, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The world would never know how close it came to losing 418 lives. And that was exactly how it should be, because true responsibility does not seek attention, it seeks safety. And once, long ago, a 19-year-old mechanic chose to speak when it mattered most, and the sky gave everyone back to the ground.